everyone. I'm Leah Mix, CEO of Delphi. Welcome to our Insight Session. Today, we have an incredible presentation by Senior Policy and Research Partner here at Delphi, Floris Wolswijk, who will be talking about reimbursement pathways in Europe. With that, I'll turn it over to Floris. We will have a Q&A session at the end of Floris's presentation. Please enjoy.
Welcome, everyone. Great to have you all here. And I'm looking forward to presenting more about psychedelics and reimbursement. I'll be focusing a bit on Europe, but of course the lessons apply to everywhere, to America and the rest of the world. So as Leah said, I'm a senior project manager and also a bit of a researcher at Delphi. And I've been looking at how psychedelics can be implemented for over the last 3 years, but it's all started with me looking at the research on psychedelics. I'm a psychologist by background, and one of the things I wanted to know, what is that psychedelic research? What has been done there? Founder Blossom, which is an intelligence platform that looks at psychedelics, but really looking at the research, at the trials. That's good, that's interesting, that's very promising, and we'll assume for now those results really hold and there is a treatment that can really help a lot of people. But how do we put that into practice? What are the barriers? What is that infrastructure? What needs to happen? And I want to talk a bit more about that today. I have a little bit of on-the-ground experience. I'm the co-founder of Flow Coaching, but in practice, my wife does most of the work there, where we help people with psychedelic-assisted coaching, something that is available already in the Netherlands. That's a small framework, which I'll talk about in a bit more depth shortly, but that's very different from reimbursed care. And also talk about why that's different and why we want reimbursed care. Why can I talk a bit more about reimbursed care, or where I can even talk way longer than the 25-30 minutes I'll talk today, as I also wrote a report on reimbursement pathways for psychedelic therapies. It was published in April of this year, and there I, together with Martin Gisby, a market access consultant, really looked at what is there around psychedelic research and then towards the implementation in Europe. But again, those lessons apply both to the US, Australia, UK, so all around the world. So why do I think that coverage defines the future of psychedelic care? I was preparing for this presentation, I felt like, how can I divide this into a few different areas, or why this is important, why coverage needs to happen to make psychedelics become something that's accessible, equitable, something that is trusted. So these are the 4 categories that I came up with. And in a way, they all make sense, but I just want to walk through them real quick. And for instance, what you see here in the Netherlands is that maybe thousands, if I'm optimistic, 10,000-ish people get access to psychedelic care through the coaching framework that's there. But it's not enough people to be able to cover that you can do in the current normal healthcare system. So how can we bring those 2 worlds together? But also for other frameworks like in Oregon or Colorado or in Switzerland, there's just a small number of people that get access to psychedelic care. And if it's reimbursed, it becomes more accessible. So we get thousands treated and not the tens, the hundreds. But also lends to legitimacy, going through the trial process to the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then getting access that really gives a signal to people that might not normally be interested in psychedelics. I'm always thinking of my parents who are generally doing well, but they would never think about doing psychedelics if there is a mental health issue. How can we get those people that are not already in our psychedelic bubble, in our psychedelic ecosystem, to see this as one of the options that's available? And maybe it's available for people who have a mental health issue that they've been struggling with for a long while, or maybe in time it can become something that's accessible even earlier. So it gives a signal of trust, a signal of quality, but maybe also, very probably, also reduces stigma. And then equity. If it's now available, say, in Australia for about 30,000 Australian dollars, that's not something that everyone can pay. That's something that a very small percentage of people can pay. So how can we avoid a 2-tier system and make psychedelics accessible to not just the wealthy, but to everyone? And then finally, something that maybe not everyone's thinking about, but making psychedelics become reimbursed care also gives a signal towards investors that this is a category to invest in, that this is something that is legitimate and not something for the hippies, which I guess if I was born a few years earlier, I would probably fall under the category, but really something that's available and that is investable. And some of the things that we've already seen, a new signal coming up from pharma developers becoming interested in psychedelic pharma companies, making both investments or even now buying up some of those companies. So what I don't really want to talk about is who pays for psychedelics, but how do they become available so the payment doesn't become a thing that is a barrier. Where are we now today with psychedelics? What has happened recently? What are some updates that you might have missed? Some of this even happened over the summer without me staying a bit up to date on what's what. I might even have missed something, or I might still be missing something here. But we do see in Europe, seeing the first large signals of psychedelics become something that can become reimbursed care. Most of the changes that I've put here have happened since the publication of the report in April. So there's a new momentum, a newfound energy in Europe to think about psychedelics becoming reimbursed care. And there are different pathways to that becoming reimbursed care. I'll talk about that on the next slide. Just quickly on a few of these developments. So in Norway, we see that psychedelics, and taking ketamine is a broader definition of psychedelics, becoming more available. So up to this point in a lot of countries in Europe, I guess around the world, Spravato is the only thing that's available, and that's the S-ketamine nasal spray by Johnson & Johnson. But that's quite expensive. And if you compare it against racemic or just ketamine that you can get, for instance, for pain or for anesthesia, it's orders of magnitude more expensive. So what they've done there is now make a reimbursement available for generic ketamine. We can see this on the one hand as a positive signal, so saying it becomes cheaper, it becomes more available for everyone. The other hand, it gives a negative signal to developers, at least Johnson thinks so, of them wanting to develop medicines for Europe. Because if we're making it available for cheap, just for the price of a generic drug, then what's their incentive to really go after the market and to go for authorization? And I'll talk about that process in 2 slides. So I think that's a big question or an interesting tension that's there. Sort of on European wide, and I cheekily put this by excluding the United Kingdom, but that's the PsyPal trial. So that's a big trial that's happening across Europe for people with life-threatening diseases, really to help them with their anxiety, the depression that's associated with it. It's happening across multiple countries with, think about 10 or 12 different stakeholders across Europe. So that's really good to see that going on and to see our larger study being done here in Europe. It's also funded by Horizon, which is a big European funding bucket for research. And there again, we see more applications being done for that money. So also government funding, which in the US has been lacking until I think 2017-ish, also becoming available in Europe. So legitimizing psychedelic research and later hopefully access to. One of the cool things that is done in the research is that they are already measuring things like quality of life and healthcare utilization. And this is also something that's in Europe, maybe a bit more versus the US, is important for that evaluation of seeing which psychedelics can be something that's implemented at scale and done effectively and cost effectively. Then in Germany, something that was out of left field is that there's now compassionate use of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. I think it'll become available at the start of next year. Is one of the leading psychiatrists in Germany and involved with the Ovid Clinic and the Mind Foundation, so 2 of the big nonprofits and clinics. So Ovid is the clinic, Mind is the nonprofit, but he's really been at the forefront of this, and in their clinics, there'll be compassionate use access. But again, what I talked about earlier, this is something that's really small for maybe 50, 100 people a year, and maybe expands a bit. But again, this is a really small number of people, but it is real world evidence. So it can help develop that evidence base, train therapists in applying, in administrating psychedelics, and really seeing what works here. And then in the Czech Republic, medical psilocybin will become available next year. So there again, there's a new model being developed that hasn't been tried out yet. There's still a lot of questions, or at least I have a lot of questions around what will be reimbursed, how will the reimbursement go? And for instance, there also ketamine is available for reimbursement. So there are some good signals, some good steps being done. And think if you would ask me 12 months ago, Czech Republic, what are they doing? Like maybe it's Stangroth from the past, but actually they're at the forefront now of psychedelics in Europe and really trying different things out. Also seeing within the UN conventions and what are the regulations, what are the schedules, can you sort of see that medical route that you can go through without having to do the rescheduling. And Switzerland, that has a long continued medical exemption use, also from the 1990s and then again from 2014, being able to administer psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA under exceptional circumstances. So again, for a very small patient population, but something that is being done where we are collecting a bit of data. Again, not as much as you would do in a normal reimbursed care setting. And in Portugal, I'm just highlighting this as this is a recent development. But again, here we're seeing the first clinical use guidelines, so really developing how, when it becomes available, how are we going to do this? Because these are the nuts and bolts that might be boring to a lot of people, but I find endlessly fascinating to think about what are all the steps that are necessary and what things can we learn now before those phase 3 trials are there, before we have that bigger data set. So access, how do we do that? Here, there's a lot of information on the slide, so I'll just talk to you through a bit on what the different routes are and what I'm thinking about here. I'm really thinking about what are the different routes for psychedelics to become available in a legal way, in an hopefully accessible way. So I'm not thinking about decriminalization or underground or unregulated, say, coaching framework that we have in the Netherlands, but really thinking about these other pathways. And there, I just tried to score them a bit based on our reports before. How useful, how effective are the different routes? And there I'm thinking both about the scale. So how do psychedelics reach the most amount of people? And say, for instance, if it's self-pay, if it's compassionate use, it will be limited to tens, hundreds of people, right? So the scale is very low. Equity, how equitable is the access? Durability, can we keep doing this? Is this something that's sustainable? And there again, for compassionate use, it's something that will want to go on for forever. Or for instance, cross-border, people going from one country to another country with the free travel and then being able to get some care in other countries. That's not something that's happening now, although you can say for coaching here in the Netherlands, that might happen, but that's not durable. And then the data utility. So can we collect data that's then again useful for strengthening the case for psychedelics? And finally, the policy risk. So here I can think about how feasible is this in the political environment. And then compassionate use, like that's relatively easy, or that's good to slide in right now. And the same for philanthropically backed funding for these treatments. That's relatively easy to sidestep the political arena, but there's a lot of other red bullets on the side of it. And what I really want to say, without going into depth on all the qualifications here, is that I think we should be targeting a modified or conditional pathway versus a standard reimbursement pathway. And why am I saying that? Because psychedelics are different than the current treatments. So psychedelics, in contrast to, for instance, SSRIs, are a treatment that has a lot of upfront cost. Also, a treatment where we see possible long duration benefits. So for some of the long-term follow-ups that I've been tracking on Blossom, we see that over 5 years, people are still doing better. But then again, we have to ask, can we quantify this? People are doing better, and we see that on, say, depression or PTSD scores, but can we also quantify this based on how much healthcare they are using? And between different countries in Europe, how much of that information is useful and how much of that will be considered? So for instance, in the Netherlands, we're thinking more of those second order benefits, the benefit to society, to people. Whilst in Germany, for instance, that is not really taking into account. So it's really more looking at the individual, at the healthcare cost for that person. We talked a lot about what is happening here, what are the different routes. So just taking into account all those routes, or really thinking about the reimbursement route. How do patients actually get covered? A big caveat for this slide, it really depends on when phase 3 trials are completed successfully. So we have phase 3 trials, say from Compass, from Usona, well, there is one from Lykos, but maybe they have to do another one of these. That's what the FDA is requesting, or other developers that are now in phase 2. So when will we get those definitive results? And when will they go to Europe and present their data here and go for authorization? So here I've put into the darker orange color, the optimistic, then the realistic, and then the pessimistic scenario. So in terms of steps, like how does this go? And maybe also how is it slightly different from the US? So first the trials, collecting that data, and then presenting that to the EMA. And the EMA is similar to the FDA, but then the European Medicines Agency. So doing that evaluation there. And then again, it's about, is this drug effective? So that's relatively similar to the FDA. So comparing it against a placebo and saying, can this be something that works? But then there's a bit of a change, or a change in Europe versus the United States, is that then at a country level, there will be a health technology assessment. So HTA. And they will say, can this medicine be implemented in our country? And this is where things become a bit more tricky. We have 27 member states, and each of them has to make a decision on this. And then, for instance, in Germany, they really want to see a comparative study against the standard of care. And that might differ per psychedelic or per indication. Is that an SSRI? Is that talk therapy? What type of talk therapy? And they do really usually, and the stakeholders we're speaking to, they keep on saying this, they do want to see that head-to-head trial. So then, for instance, a German consortium is now, they have done the episode study, so a phase 2 trial, and they want to do a phase 3 trial where they actually do this head-to-head comparison. But what if a US developer doesn't have that head-to-head comparison? Do they need to do a small trial in Europe, and can they use the US data? Likely they can use the US data, but then how much more evidence do they need to generate, or can they even generate that information later on? These are points where the EMA hasn't really provided too much clarity on, but there has been big discussion in May last year with the EMA. There have been some viewpoint from them, but again, still there's a lot of uncertainty on how we go from EMA authorization to the National Health Technology Assessment. Something that can happen in parallel with that step is the system integration. So really thinking about, how do we make this happen, the nuts and bolts. Do we need to have, or how do we define those codes on how it will be reimbursed? Can we just use the normal codes that a psychologist, a pharmacist, a psychiatrist can use currently? Or do we really need to make other codes? Like in the US, there are now temporary codes for psychedelics. Accreditation, like what needs to be done? What is the training that needs to be there? So here again, there are some examples, some programs that are quite comprehensive from, say, the Open Foundation or again the Mind Foundation, but will they be accepted by the psychologists, by the psychiatrists, by the other professional associations? And who will be trained? What training do people need? How involved will it be? All a lot of questions that are still open. And then hopefully there will be reimbursement. So you see in my optimistic scenario here, it's at the start of 2029. So maybe for some of you, Floris, this is gonna take forever. And yeah, it's gonna take a while, but hopefully by preparing a bit better for this, we can make this go faster. So what must be in place for success? Again, there's a lot here on the slide. So I'll just talk a bit about a few of them. But we really need to have a lot of the plumbing, a lot of that infrastructure already in place. And I think we can do that, and we can already prepare at this moment versus waiting for when a developer goes to EMA, or when a developer does this themselves just for their drug, just for one indication. I think we have an opportunity now to prepare the system in a way to make this more effective, more efficient, and eventually more actable. So these are some of the things I already talked about, but maybe just to highlight a few, like we already during trials, so all trials or all like phase 2, phase 3 trials that are happening in Europe, start collecting the right types of data that is both useful for that HTA and for that EMA evaluation. And I think that's HTA type data that's important and it might be missed by US focused drug developers, and then maybe they'll come to Europe as an afterthought. And so we really want to be proactive to say this is what needs to be collected. And then, for instance, on the Cybel project, that this data is already being collected. And we're also involved with another consortium that is already thinking about collecting this data. So it's a bit there in the zeitgeist, but it isn't much there. And then again, even taking one step back on health economic data, currently there aren't many, or even there's just one and a half studies on Europe on how effective psychedelics will be. So even just analyzing the US data and then mapping it onto European healthcare systems is a thing I think we can already start doing to provide that early signal, to provide talking points for politics to say that this is something that's effective. And just think 1 or 2 days ago, Elliot Marseille is, of course, of the kind of grandfather or leader in this part of the research. He looked at this in the US and how this can be done, but he's also looked at Ukraine and really mapped out like if MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD is implemented there at different price points, when or in which conditions is it effective. And in a lot of those scenarios, he does say it's effective and cost effective. And maybe just a final thing to highlight is that developing all this information, preparing the system, has to be done in a way at a European level to say these are guidelines, these are standards, these are things we're thinking about to prepare for this implementation. But how do you also localize this to a country? How do you get their psychiatrist association, their pharmacist, their payers, which again is different per European country, how the whole system is configured? How do you get everyone prepared and present them the right data? A lot to think about, and it's a lot that I'm thinking about. So just for the final few minutes, I'll talk about one of the things I'm also working on as one of the projects here at Delphi. Because we do a lot of consulting, we help different stakeholders within the ecosystem, but we also try to build up the ecosystem ourselves. And the project we're working on now, and I like to call it the plumbing because it's behind the scenes, but infrastructure might be a better general word to use, is on reimbursement and infrastructure for psychedelics in Europe. And we abbreviated that as RIPE because I think Europe is ripe for the implementation of psychedelics, or to really strategically start thinking about this. So the mission statement is here on the slide, but what I really want to say is that we're now starting to build both a coalition and a blueprint. So I mapped out a few different things that need to happen or that can happen already that I think we want to see happen for the greater good and not just being done by one developer when they go for the application. We're building both this blueprint and getting all the different stakeholders in Europe together to discuss what needs to be in that blueprint and what needs to be done. And the blueprint isn't just saying these are different things that need to be done, but also how much will it cost? Which are the different stakeholders can do it? Who's that health economist here in Europe that can do it? So we're bringing all those different parts together. If you think this is something that's interesting to me, if you're interested in contributing to this, both as a funder, as someone who thinks they can contribute their resources, their thoughts, their ideas, please feel free to email me at floriswolswijk@delphicircle.com. That's it for this insight session. We'll have about 15 minutes for the Q&A. So thank you so much for your attention. And now please use the Q&A system to put in your questions, and then Leah and I will take them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Floris. We know that what you're presenting today represents a tremendous amount of research and analysis and wisdom and intelligence that you have brought to bear on the reimbursement for psychedelics in Europe. And that if this is really taken into consideration, it will accelerate the possibility of those therapies being accessible sooner to a broader range of people. While we're waiting for others to weigh in on the questions, could you say a little bit about the support that you're looking for to move the RIPE initiative forward so we can get all of the stakeholders oriented and coordinated around reimbursement pathways?
I'm thinking along two routes, and I wasn't too explicit during the presentation, but I guess it can be now. Like we're looking on the one end for money, right? So from people who want to support this stage in more of a philanthropic way as something that is necessary now, but that's not something that a developer will do. And what you're also saying, like they'll be focused more on their program, and it will be done later. I think some people are aware of the need to do this at this stage versus waiting longer. I think that's maybe good to highlight that if you wait longer, maybe some habits, some systems, some conventions will be put into place that don't serve the greater good or don't make it available to a broad audience or might focus just on what one developer might want to do, and that might not be the most effective or the most equitable. So that's a part of it where I see it, that funding that's more from a philanthropic minded audience. I think it's important now. The other part, what people can do, really depends on the different stakeholders, but really engaging, well, I guess talking with us, but engaging with the broader healthcare and policy system. And there, you see some people really already doing this. So you see Psychedelics Europe, Pareas, or those different groups already engaging with the EMA, with the European Commission, really seeing how do we get them involved and get them more familiar with what psychedelics are. But then even say on health technology assessment, like how do we prepare the system to look at something that happens in a relatively short amount of time, so say 12 weeks, that can have long-lasting positive effects that that's not something you see with other talk therapies or with SSRIs. So it's a very different paradigm. And how can we get evaluators on board with that? And I know about a large healthcare payer conference, which I can name at the moment, but they'll have their first panel on psychedelics and really think about how do we even engage with this, really getting people outside of a bubble involved. I think that's important.
Thank you so much. We see similar issues here in the US with what you're talking about in terms of siloing that tends to happen through the drug development process. And so that there's a myopic attention that is focused on a single drug therapy, for example, and that drug developer, a lot of weight being put on what that drug developer is doing or how they define who has access to it, what the protocol looks like, and so forth. And we see both in Europe and the US similar things whereby that doesn't really lend to broad, safe, affordable access. It tends to weight access towards those who are already financially well off and doesn't really it takes a lot longer for there to be ubiquitous access to people who are really in need of these therapies. So efforts like this, which are not going to be paid for by industry, although industry would benefit from them, do need to be philanthropically supported. And so this is for a greater vision for psychedelic therapies and the accessibility to them. The fact that you undertook this work, I feel is very hopeful. You and Martin really dove in and took this on in collaboration with Perea and some of the other organizations that you mentioned. One of the questions that I have is about the obstacles and opportunities that you see in Europe and the US and how those compare to one another. And are there opportunities there for international collaboration that could be mutually beneficial?
I think definitely learning from what has been done in the US already and what has been successful and what have been the things that haven't worked out. A very concrete example is the CPT codes, the billing codes for psychedelics, and that has happened. There are those codes, and that's something that yeah, as far as I know, just hasn't been discussed here in Europe. So can we take a lot of the lessons on how the process has happened from brain futures, from others? Are the lessons that we can take in from there? What we hope for is that Europe is not just waiting patiently for a US developer to come to Europe and jump into the Byzantine system that we have here and say we will try for Germany and maybe France as sort of big markets, or go to the UK because there is that sort of mutual agreement that hasn't really been used much, but might make it easier to apply in the UK. But yeah, really see, can we make the ground more fertile? Can we make it more accessible for things to happen here in Europe? And it could again be those US-based drug developers that want to come here, but also see what can be, I wouldn't say develop in-house, but what is it that European stakeholders can do themselves? And one of the things, for instance, is doing that real-world evidence collection. So, for instance, for that compassionate use access in Germany, like really tracking data there and really seeing, okay, what is it that works both in terms of depression scores, but also what's the use of services both during treatment but also after. So do health costs go down, for instance, and what's the quality of life improvement? So already collecting the data, I think, can be really helpful. And then maybe in a year or two, we'll say, okay, there are pilots in the Netherlands, in Portugal, in, well, Czech Republic is going to be there. Can we already, yeah, collect that and use that? Because one of the more speculative, and I think I haven't even discussed it, routes is to say we do something like compassionate use access, but then do that at a big scale. So make it accessible without going through through the EMA application. So compassionate use is not exactly the right word, but say some people in the Netherlands are thinking about this. Can be get psychedelic treatments just through, I would say sheer will, but have it be reimbursed care at a large scale and even sidestepping the EMA, so just get approval in the country. That can be good, check a lot of those boxes, get a lot of those lights on green. But again, then that will very likely just be for one country that can generate a lot of data.
Great. We really appreciate that you have so much expertise now on all of the different pathways for the different, let's call it jurisdictions. And one of the things that we saw when we lined up what needs to happen in the US and what needs to happen in Europe is that a lot of, and I think what you're saying is that a lot of the information that needs to be developed is very similar, but then the processes and the regulatory bodies that would use that information is different. And in Europe, for example, I like to say they have more of a go slow to go fast opportunity there because they have larger kind of single payer systems where once the evidence reaches a threshold within the one or two regulatory bodies that need to approve it, then care tends to become broadly accessible more quickly. Whereas in the US, even after FDA approval, there is then that's just the beginning of a whole process of coverage under the spectrum of different payers that we have, which is a whole nother level of threshold of evidence that has to be achieved. But the information, training standards, clinical guidelines, as you mentioned, CPT codes, understanding the economics and why a country, a government, or a private insurance payer would invest into covering these therapies. A lot of that information is very similar and should be somewhat portable if we do go through these efforts, could be coordinated and could help accelerate adoption and coverage on both continents.
I like your distinction on saying in the US, it's different payers and different types of payers. And I guess it's here jurisdictions, different countries, how they'll evaluate the evidence. And maybe also the point that, like, for some of the smaller countries, they'll follow the bigger countries. So, for instance, the Czech Republic generally, like not what they've done now, but they'll follow the recommendation from or the average of three other countries and then say, this is what we can reimburse. It doesn't always imply a lot needs to be done. And then also on the HTA, that evaluation is now per country, but slowly we're trying to get to a general evaluation. So the EMA is at the EU level and then the HTA also. And that will be around 2030. So it's like, yeah, how quickly will we move with psychedelics? Will that then fall under that regulation, or will it still be country-based?
Yes, and just to put in perspective on the timelines that you're mentioning, in the US, the timelines, if nothing is done, the timelines for implementing new behavioral health treatments and therapies is over a decade to 2 decades. So what you're talking about is a pretty dramatic acceleration of those timelines. And it's hard for people maybe to know that unless they understand how long things typically take. And so your thesis here, which is, I think, spot on, is with a little bit more coordination and information development, we can accelerate those timelines and start helping people sooner rather than later and help to ensure that the way that care is covered and delivered is at high quality and not just bare bones minimum that might be more in line of what a drug developer might want to see in terms of what works for them economically. So there's a lot of good justification that there can be made for higher levels of quality care that is going to eventually result in more efficacious, more effective treatment that impacts people for longer. And then we're going to start to see those generational effects, right? Parents are more well, so their children are more well, and so forth. I think everybody on this call and everyone who might hear this presentation has the sense that we who work in psychedelics or who are invested in helping move them forward, such as with the initiatives that you're working on, Floris, could see the needle move in how we treat mental health conditions and in human flourishing in our lifetimes, right? And really actually make a tangible impact on that. And I think that your work really speaks to that and really gives us hope that we could move that needle even further.
Thank you, Leah. I think that's very well said, and I think something we're all striving towards to really help improve mental health. And yeah, I think we're all convinced, but still always critical of the evidence like, that psychedelics can be a big lever to pull here.
Great. And Floris, we did have one question come in from Kevin Lanza. This is a great question if you would mind answering it before we wrap up. What would you suggest would be an ideal outcome of the psychedelics panel at the payer conference that you mentioned earlier? What sort of topics would you advise be prioritized now? Great question.
A really good question. And the information about the panel will be available publicly on Monday. I think the most important thing, or the thing that I think is missing most now, is payers think about the health outcomes and the economic data around it. Health economics and outcomes research is sort of a category where this falls under. And that's, we just have nothing in Europe. It is, maybe that's very too on the nose to say, but I think we can see that I can't imagine that it can work in Europe, or I can see in my head if everything comes together that this is feasible, this is doable. And the recent study by Elliot Marseille and others like on Ukraine is saying, okay, if implemented there, it can really work. I'm still a bit baffled why we don't have more studies on this in Europe. On the one hand, we don't have a lot of European-based data, but some of the trials do take place in Europe, or part of the trials take place in Europe. And yeah, I think it's not unfeasible to sort of take the current data from clinical trials and try and map it onto European healthcare systems and see what the impact can be. I know of an unpublished thesis here in the Netherlands that tries to do this for MDMA, and they're like, can you see? Oh, it's possible. So one of the things that one of the work streams with RIPE that we're advocating for is doing this type of study. And it costs a bit of money, but I think it's money well spent that will generate evidence that really convinces people outside of a bubble. Like, we believe in this. A lot of us have experienced this ourselves. But I think if we can give them really concrete, hard numbers, I think that will help convince them better than our stories, which are also important.
Great. I think that ending on that note, I think that is a thesis that we're all working with, that when it comes to psychedelics, it is a spend money to make money situation, especially on a societal level. And I absolutely agree with you that those numbers can be run, and there could be a demonstration of the dollars and cents value of covering and implementing psychedelic therapies. So that's great, Floris, and I really hope that you're able to get some traction on that, and can all continue to push on that front. And thanks everyone who was here.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and we'll see you again on October 1st. So Lee and I will go off screen. I'll leave the slide on there in a moment, and then we'll see you guys again soon. Thank you.